So let's kick it off. So the First Astronomers, How Indigenous Elders Read the Stars, goes into detail of Indigenous astronomy, the First Astronomers and the First Astronomy, the science of the stars that existed before and independently of Western science. This is something that First Australians developed long ago. Knowledge of the stars is also used as a guide for informing traditional law, social behaviours, kinship systems, and marriage classes, a practice that continues today. So Uncle Ghillar, we might kick off with you if that's okay. What does it mean to be an elder of the Euahlayi Nation, and how did you learn about your nation's star knowledge?
What's it like to be an elder? It comes with great responsibility, and it's the knowledge holding. It's for some reason maybe they choose the right ones who are not going to go senile and end up with dementia and things. So touch wood, I'm doing reasonably well right now. There's a lot of knowledge. It's just not about the stars. It's about being able to connect those star constellations and those areas within the night skies to land where the stories are, and being able to understand who those stories belong to, not just knowing them, but whose country they are on as well. Because when you read those stars, you're reading right across a massive landscape, and so if you look at Australia, you put it down on a table, and then you're able to see the whole of Australia, and you're able to look at those stars, and you can tell where things are and where people are. And different people, we all have stories, we all have connections to all of those things that's in the sky. And so when you're traveling through your country, you know exactly where you are. And as a senior elder, you have greater knowledge than the ordinary man on the street or the person next to you, because there's great knowledge about responsibility to others and holding those stories as well, and understanding how to connect to those places. So when you understand that, you follow those song lines and you read those stars at nighttime. You can't read anything in the daytime. Everything is night.
Absolutely, and that's something I definitely learned from the book, is that not all stellar navigation is about following the stars at night. And I think you've touched on a really important point there about the journey across land. Are you able to share your knowledge of the travel routes across southeastern Queensland, including those star maps and songlines?
Well, we read a section of the stars which take us, like we're in northern New South Wales, and if people can get a map out, we're right on the border of New South Wales, Queensland, inland by about 10 hours. So that's, if you go about 700 kilometres inland, you probably hit us, yeah? Now, when you go north into Queensland, where a lot of our stories go, because we're part of the Murray group, we're not part of the linguistical Koori group. We're still part of the Murray group, which goes all the way to the Gulf. And when you look at that Gulf, we got that big area where that 𝗦𝗣𝗘𝗔𝗞𝗘𝗥𝗦, the red-bellied black snake, come down through our country from up that way, from the Gulf country. And there's a big pathway that he when he came down this way. And so when we look up in the sky up there, we're looking at what we call Warrumburu, and Warrumburu is just the big river in the sky. And that snake, when he come through our country, he brought the water with him because he cut a way through there. And that's the ancient sea, inland sea, that came from the Gulf. And so, and the people and the bloke who came with him, the spirit was a bloke, the Duane, the crow, he traveled with him down into our country. And that goes down into Wiradjuri as well. But our cutoff is, as in Australia, people will know, is the Macquarie Marshes on the Macquarie River. Now, but Wiradjuri then takes over, and they got that big story where he curled up down that way at a place called Lake Cowell. Now, so these stories are up there in the sky. We can follow his pathway. Now, when we travel into Queensland, we don't go all the way up that way, but we know where everything connects to. We know where the story places are, and we're able to travel that way. Now, when we look at our pathway into Queensland, we travel about 200 to 300 kilometres for ceremony. And, that takes about 2 months by foot or 3 months by foot. And so you get prepared. And in doing that, you can only go there with an invitation, and that's the message sticks. You got to have the leader got to carry that hanging from a spear, so that the people, when you come across people, they see that message stick and they won't interfere with you. So it's like a passport when you're traveling across country in our world, and that takes us across. So yeah, we go for quite a distance. The longest one is from our country up into the 𝗦𝗣𝗘𝗢𝗦𝗡 Mountains, up in the mountains up north of Toowoomba in Queensland. And so when we get there, we meet with coastal people, and then if we choose, we then follow the pathway down the Great Dividing Range, and that's following the Bogong moth story after we get to the do the 𝗦𝗣𝗘𝗢𝗦𝗡 ceremonies. Now, not everybody goes. Of course, you have senior leaders and their young ones, and the senior women will go, and the young women. So you might have about 8 to 10 people traveling. The rest of the people will stop at a certain place, and they will continue ceremonies with our neighbouring tribes in those places. But that route, when we look up there, the stars tell us whether, if they're bright, we know there's a lot of water there. And if they're dull, well, then we know there's not much water there. So we're going to turn around. We're not going to go that way. We go another way where they're brighter stars, and we know there's plenty of water that way.
That's so fascinating. From my reading of the book, I understand that the most famous example of the dark constellation in Australia is that of the emu. Are you able to talk a little bit about that and the season change and the emu behaviour?
Well, that emu, that's what we call 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪. 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 lays in the water up there, and she's it's a featherless emu. It doesn't have feathers on, even though I drew it with feathers on. And during this session, that emu will start forming around March, about April, May. And then you'll see the legs protruding as well when you see that. When we see that starting to form at this time, we know then when the legs are there, and we can see that grey matter which forms the legs, we know that they're pairing up. That means they've boyfriend and girlfriend all getting together, and they start mating. This is the mating period. And then when the legs start disappearing, we know they're laying. The birds are starting to lay their eggs. And then all that time, then when we see the neck between the body and the head, when we see that starting to disappear, then what we realise then that that's the time the chicks are forming in the eggs, and we're not allowed to go and get the eggs anymore because there's blood in those eggs. And so when people are desperately hungry at this time, they will always crack an egg and see if there's blood in it. So that, you might have a late older bird who's laying eggs, and you end up with a good egg. The other thing, when we take them, we're not allowed to touch the eggs with our hands, because the emus do have a sense of smell, and they will pick up on any foreigners touching their eggs, and they will break the egg if you've touched it. So you're always told to roll it out. But these times, when you look at the stars up there, they tell us exactly when we can and when we can't do things.
Wonderful. That's so fascinating. Thank you so much. I know I'm really interested to learn about, how did the collaboration on this book with Professor Duane come about?
I think it came about through a mutual friend of ours, Robert Fuller, who pestered me until I gave in. But Duane and I ended up meeting up and collaborating because we both have a great passion for this, and letting the public know about it. I think it's worth letting the people know that we here in Australia, we hold many stories about the creation. And our whole society is governed by that system, and people, they don't realise when they came here and invaded this country, the British had no idea what was here, and they still don't know. They're only just starting to find out. And unfortunately, a lot of the old people who have passed on, died with a lot of knowledge, but there are some of us who were fortunate to be to learn this knowledge and to be able to keep it and keep it alive.
Well, I must say I'm very glad that they kept pestering you and you did give in, because it's a very, very great read. Professor Duane, I guess this leads into you. You can see through the book how passionate you are. I'd be interested to understand what drove you to learn about Indigenous astronomy, and where did it all begin?
Well, growing up, you know, being born in the late 70s and growing up in the 80s in the US, I kind of got pulled into that American fascination with all things Australian, with, you know, Crocodile Dundee and Men at Work and everything else. But I'd always been passionate about travel and about other cultures, but also, of course, about astronomy. That was always my first love. And when I had the opportunity to come to Australia for the very first time as a study abroad student from the middle of the US, I came to Sydney and had a remarkable semester. It really was phenomenal. But there was an experience I had there that I didn't know at the time. It was going to change the trajectory of my life and career and lead to where we are now. And I was at Macquarie University, and it was the second half of the year, second semester. So I got there in late July. And in August, Mars had reached its closest opposition, so its closest point to the Earth, in something like 60,000 years. So it was a really great opportunity to go to the telescopes on the campus observatory and have, you know, check it out, go have a look. So me and another one of the study abroad students went, and she and I went up, and we were having a lot of fun. Now, I should preface this by saying a lot of the other study abroad students and exchange students were doing the first year Indigenous Studies course, but I wasn't. I was fairly old at that time. I was in my mid-20s at that point, because my undergraduate degree took a bit longer than I expected. So I was doing astrophysics courses instead of other subjects. But you know, we were looking at Mars, and I remember asking somebody, well, what are some of the Aboriginal traditions about the stars? Because I knew absolutely nothing about that. And the response I got was very dismissive and quite vile. And it shocked the two of us. We were like looking at each other like, did they just say that? Like, it was really, really bad. And we just sort of walked away. And I couldn't quite understand that mentality. I couldn't wrap my head around it. When I moved back to Australia 2 years later to pursue a PhD in astrophysics, I kept getting drawn back to that experience. And whenever I would ask somebody here about the star knowledge of Aboriginal people, I would always get the same response. Oh, they're just myths and legends. Oh, they're just a few names and stories. And if I ever asked about, well, what about the science of that, it would just be flat out dismissed. And it didn't take very much at all to look and see that there were tremendous layers of science embedded within this knowledge. It's not everything. There's a lot more to this stuff than just astronomy or just science, of course. But that was the area that I knew a little bit about science, and it was something that I noticed that Australians broadly just were not looking at or paying attention to or acknowledging or respecting, even though it was quite obvious. And I decided to change everything I was doing. I stopped working in astrophysics. I went on to pursue a PhD on this topic, and I've been doing that for 14 years. And that's been the motivation behind the book, and the motivation behind everything I do, is to show the public that this knowledge contains a tremendous depth of science.
I couldn't agree more. I think something that I picked up from reading the book was the importance of culture and science. That's something that I definitely had not considered myself. That was a key lesson for me. I'd be keen to understand what are the dynamic lessons you've learned from the elders, and how this is challenging the Western ideas of nature and science.
We'd be here for quite some time going into all those examples. It's, you know, it's always been a significant learning experience. And as we say, a learning curve is going from the world of astrophysics to the world of, you know, learning about Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous studies. I don't know why some people in the sciences might think that's easier. It's not. It's a lot harder. And I found it to be incredibly challenging, but in a way that I really enjoy. And it's been a constant learning experience, and it will always be a learning experience until the day that I die. But what I really like the most of all of this is seeing the connections between the land and the sky in ways that I had never thought about. I had never thought about the ways in which I look at objects in the sky and how they can change so subtly, but how those subtle changes can tell you things that are so significant. You know, a good example is the twinkling stars. In the world of astrophysics, twinkling stars are a hindrance. They're something that we really, really hate. When you're looking through a telescope to collect data on distant stars, they create a lot of noise. You know, anything that causes the image to change, the brightness or color, anything like that is a real problem. We have to get over that. But as I learned from the elders in the communities, that the twinkling stars isn't a hindrance to be overcome, that it is an extraordinarily useful tool as part of your toolkit to understanding the world around you. And if you know how to read all the subtle ways the stars can twinkle, that can tell you about what's happening on the land, how fast they twinkle, are they changing colors, what do they look like, are they fuzzy, are they kind of sharp, all these little things that in astrophysics, we're trying to overcome all of that and get rid of it. We spend billions of dollars putting telescopes in space. But if we stop and look at them in a different way, we can find a whole different world of use and application for that that isn't really looked at in Western science. And these ways that the communities have long observed the stars are now leading to new approaches in astrophysics that we didn't even think about. You know, the sounds aurora make, you know, long known by Indigenous peoples around the world, including here in Australia, but only known by Western science a few years ago. It's really quite remarkable.
Absolutely. And I think that understanding is key. And I think we've all been living in a time of uncertainty, in particular in Australia with the recent natural disasters and the flooding. This is a question for the both of you. How do you think the stars can give us guidance and stability right now?
Duane, you want to start?
Well, I think you'd probably be very qualified, but I think one of the things that we can learn from that is that we live in a dynamic world. It's always changing, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. The stars shift in the sky. The ice ages come and go. The ocean rises and drops. Islands become mountains. A landscape changes. This can happen on various time scales. But what we see are people in this country and around the world who've been here for tens of thousands of years have developed systems of knowledge and adaptation that can take people through these changes. And if we're going to navigate our way through the really rapid changes that we're facing today, we need to learn from people who've gone through this sort of thing in the past. And that's one of the many ways that we can learn a lot from this traditional knowledge. But also, we can actually measure the effects of climate change through the stars. And the way that we do that is that the elders everywhere talk about how everything on the land is reflected in the sky and everything in the sky is reflected on the land. And what that means is when the stars rise and set at dusk and dawn throughout the year inform the behavior of the animals, of the plants, of the changing seasons, and they all sync up. But what's happening now is that climate change and these natural disasters that we're facing because of that are causing things to go out of sync. And we can measure that change in synchronicity, but we need to think of ways that we can address this problem because the animals, for example, when they're breeding, they need specific climate conditions and temperatures or else the eggs can't survive or they can't, you know, do what they need to do. So we need to find ways that we can work our way through this system, but also looking back at the ancient ways of sustainability and how we can live in the future and survive instead of destroying ourselves.
If I can just go on from where Duane left off, he's touched on a very, very important point for a lot of us who've been speaking about this. I'm talking about elders now, and I only came back last week from the Pilbara and meeting with people from Mardu in the Great Sandy Desert, the Great Gippsland Desert and so on. And we're all talking about the same thing. What we're saying is that the animal behaviors and bird behavior right around this country is confusing us. And what we're looking at when we look at the night sky, we're trying to work out what is the shift, where is the shift, because we're noticing birds breeding earlier. We notice that other birds are traveling much later than they normally do. And so we're trying to work this out. But there's also another factor in this whole thing, and that is we're also trying to look at how we synchronize things, and Duane touched on this slightly, but we also looking at the weather patterns in terms of the changes. Like, for example, you know, they used to always talk about the August winds. Yeah, those August winds now come in September, mid-September to October, and that's quite confusing to us. And we, by reading the winds, they're out of sync with what we're looking at up in the sky, and so the behaviour of the spirits of the winds is really having significant impacts. And we're starting to see duller areas in the sky than we normally have. And so this is something that we need to look at, because after all, Duane touched on the fact that, you know, we've survived 2 ice ages and, you know, numerous droughts and all sorts of climate change and sea rises. So what we're trying to understand now is who's impacting. Is this a natural phenomena, or is this man-made? And that's what's confusing to us. And I guess the sooner us old fellas, and I'm allowed to say old now, sooner the old fellas, sooner we can get away from the TV and listening to, you know, those meteorologists and not meteorologists. What do you call them? People who predict the weather. As soon as we can stop listening to them and read the stars and depend on them and depend on the winds and the animals and understand how to sync those things, and if we can see how they're out of sync, then we understand that there's a change that is far greater than man really understands, and we need to look at that. And we haven't had time to sit together and talk about that, but we did talk about it 2 weeks ago in Port Hedland when I met with some of the elders, and we're all saying the same things. Even the tides are different, and we need to look at this very closely, because that's impacting on us, and the temperature, the temperatures are so great. And one old man last week or 2 weeks ago said, you know, the old people talked about how hot this was before. We had to go inside the caves to lay in there during the day to get away from that thing. Then we have another fella in Alice Springs who does paintings, and he actually paints the ice from the Ice Age. Yeah, so that memory has been handed down, and so we're trying to work this out, and we do have a little collective who are trying to work this out right now to look at this. But it's the winds, the birds, reading the sky. They're the things that we're looking at. We're trying to get them in sync. If we can't put them in sync, we know we're all in trouble here.
Wow, I think I could talk to you both for hours and hours about this. I've still got so much to learn, but what we might do is open it up for Q&A and get some interest from the audience. So please submit your questions in the chat. I'll read them out to you guys, and then we'll go from there. So we've got one here, Uncle Ghillar, for you. I understand Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional star knowledge are connected to seasonal ecological knowledge. How does this help the communities live sustainably?
We know where the birds are going, we know where the animals are going, and we know which fruit are in season, and so we're there. One of the things that people need to understand is that some of our fruit only come on for about 2 or 3 weeks, so we've got to be in the right place at the right time to be able to take advantage of the richness of that food. And so we got to be spot on, and people have to have that knowledge of where to be at the right time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. There's another question here. Is there a history of understanding dark matter within Indigenous astronomy?
We have a lot of stories about dark matter, and that's something that yeah, a lot of it is secret stuff, but there's also public stories. But those stories are, to make sense of them, one has to spend about 15 minutes going through telling that story. But dark matter is important for us, and they're things that yeah, we'd prefer to leave them there if we can.
Thank you. Another question, we've got lots of interest. So how can young Indigenous peoples around Australia who are wanting to know more about traditional knowledge like this work more closely with elders and other researchers like Duane? So I guess this is a question for both of you.
I'll just say this, that I think the schools are doing a disservice to a lot of our students, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, and our new friends who have come from overseas to become permanent residents here, or new Australians. I think the children are missing out on a lot because the schools are not encouraging the elders to come in and talk about these things and allow the kids to talk. And I think they need to restructure the education syllabus to allow for that to happen.
And Professor Duane, I'd be interested to hear your experience. You're kind of a live example of how you have worked with elders across Australia.
We have a whole team of Aboriginal students working across the country right now in Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, who are building up their profiles, who are earning their degrees in astrophysics. I think there's 4 at the moment who've completed their undergraduate degrees and are now working on honors, masters, and PhDs. One of them is now working for the Bureau of Meteorology. So we're always looking for more students who want to come in and work in this space and begin building this up, because there's just so much that has to be done. There's no capacity for 1 or 2 people to do it all. Even 10 people are going to struggle. But what we are doing to make this happen is that we are developing university courses and degree programs, which are now in place. We have Indigenous astronomy written into the Australian national curriculum. And like Uncle Ghillar said, we need people to be able to go in the classroom and talk directly about this. But at the bare minimum, we've got modules that teachers can utilize as a starting point to help include this in their lessons. And we're working on public education programs on a number of levels, everything from commemorative coins to theater productions, to documentaries, to planetarium shows, and the list could go on for quite some time. So these are all areas that we're working on actively and encouraging students to get involved, and continuing these projects, we can work directly with elders. And in fact, I'm co-supervising a master's student in Canberra who's also going to be working with Uncle Ghillar. He's a Euahlayi Nation man. And this is the exact kind of generation of people who are coming into this space right now.
Absolutely. And I think that's why sessions like this are so important, because I was definitely not exposed to this conversation at school, but now I am, and I have the opportunity to read your book. So thank you so much. There's another question here for, I think it's for you, Uncle Ghillar. Was Indigenous star knowledge shared across communities?
Always. The old ones used to talk about at night time, and you know, like I first became aware of the spirituality of the night skies, sitting down, keeping a fire going and keeping a billy boiling for the old women who were gambling at night under a tree on my village at Walgett, where I grew up as a kid. And the old ones would say, when they looked up in the sky, the old woman would say, "Son, go and get that blanket in there, or get that coat for that old woman to put over her shoulder, because that fella up there now, we got that ice coming through there from the stars." And what they were talking about is that they were talking about the dew at night, and that's the new water that comes out of the sky that they talk about at night. And so you got to cover yourself from that so that you don't get wet from that if you're sitting out there. And that's when I realized there were some really significant issues about our connection to the skies, to the night skies. And yeah, and then it followed on from that. And a lot of the kids, like when we were growing up, we were not allowed, if you were under 5 years old, they were not allowed to have a new moon rising, have the new moon shine on the kids, they had to take them away when it was rising. And I remember my great auntie, she went in the old camp, there was a crack in a little hole, nail hole, because we went to the rubbish tip and picked up tin to put on our shacks. And of course, the moonlight would shine through the cracks. And I remember her pulling beds away of the little children so that the moon did not go onto the bed where the child was. So there's some very significant matters around that.
Thank you. So I guess, Professor Duane, how has the book been received by the academic community? Is your work changing how Aboriginal knowledge is perceived?
Yes, it's been really wonderful. It's been quite a pleasant experience. When I first got into this work 14 years ago, and I was discussing this with colleagues, there was a lot of skepticism. There were people looking at me like, what are you talking about Aboriginal science? There is no Aboriginal science. And I'd sort of roll my eyes and be like, oh, okay, here we go. And this was something that was happening all across different scientific disciplines. Of course, I was working mostly in physics and astronomy. And what has happened over the last decade or dozen years or so of working in this area, we've been publishing a lot of academic research papers. They're not quite as fun to read as the book is, at least I hope. They're much drier academic papers. But we have set down in detail how all of these things work. And when we set the evidence out, the scientific community, particularly physics and astronomy, have been extremely receptive and quite progressive in that regard. Funnily enough, I thought it was going to be the other way around. I thought when I began working in this space that scholars and academics in the social sciences and humanities like anthropology and archaeology and history would be receptive, and I was going to face difficulty with the science communities, especially astrophysics. But it's turned out to be exactly the opposite. In fact, I still to this day get resistance sometimes from anthropologists and archaeologists, but the astronomical community has been extremely proactive in supporting and incorporating this, not just into outreach programs and education, which are important, but also in the way that we're actually doing astrophysics research. And this is one of the really phenomenal things that I love about this. And this book sort of details some examples of that across the board. But with the new research programs that we're developing right now, Indigenous knowledge is not something that's just stuck off in education and outreach. It's centered to the way that we're doing research, because traditional stories and knowledges about the appearance of new stars in the sky can help astrophysicists know where to point their telescopes to search for planetary nebula, which are remnants of, or supernova remnants. We can learn how the observations, ancient observations of the stars over millennia can help us understand stellar dynamics, how we can begin to work together to not only do research in new and innovative ways and educate the public, but also to fill the significant gap that we have right now. And that gap is that we only have one PhD qualified astrophysicist in Australia who's Aboriginal. And that's Dr. Stacey Mater. He's a radio astronomer who works for the CSIRO at the Parkes Radio Telescope. He lives there in Orange with you. And he's the only one at the moment, which is a pretty horrible statistic considering Aboriginal people are without question Australia's first astronomers and without question some of the earliest astronomers in the world. So it's an ancient tradition. But it's also good that we have a new generation who are stepping up and now earning their degrees. And in a few years, we're going to have a whole handful of Aboriginal people with PhDs in astrophysics.
Absolutely, that's really important. We've actually got a question here specifically around that. It is, do students need to have studied STEM or STAR studies to be able to get into this type of work with the elders and yourself?
I would say not necessarily no, but also that STEM is not separate from traditional knowledge. That's one of the things I really want to emphasize, that in the academic circles, Indigenous knowledge has always been sort of the realm of the social sciences. But the reality is that's not the situation. It is completely embedded within STEM. In fact, here at the university, the Indigenous Knowledges Institute at the University of Melbourne is within the Faculty of Science. That's because this star knowledge connects all those things together, and it is very much embedded within STEM. And that's one of the reasons why it can be so infuriating that in the past or even today, people would discourage Aboriginal students from pursuing science by saying, oh, you can't do science. Well, no, you've been doing science for tens of thousands of years. So it's not something new or something different. So I would say that students can come in and work with us on these programs from almost any academic discipline, but they're going to need to be prepared to learn a bit of astronomy.
Wonderful, thank you. I guess this is a bit of a personal question for me. How can Australian diplomats living in foreign countries educate the international community about this important knowledge?
That's a major challenge. Yeah, if they haven't learned it at home, it's going to be pretty hard for them to learn it while they're overseas. So I guess, yeah, I think maybe DFAT needs to reconsider cross-cultural training and cultural training within their department before diplomats go overseas. I believe it's it's time that they begin to do something like that. After all, I'm looking behind you, and if they don't truly believe that this is real, then they need to take away the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander flags from behind you, because otherwise they could be charged with treason for flying, other laws and culture on the same land, while at the same time having an Australian flag there. So that's how important this is. That it's got to be incorporated, and their knowledge has to be such that they can actually talk about Aboriginal issues and have Aboriginal staff, such as yourself, there on the ground to be able to take up that mantle and be able to address those issues if and when they arise in those countries and in the international arena.
Thank you. And I think these sessions on Aboriginal elders and getting yourself to speak to us is such a great opportunity for us to learn more. So thank you. There's another question here about seeing the stars in different cities in which we live. And could you tell us one or two of the best places in Australia you would recommend for stargazing?
Get out behind past the Blue Mountains, yeah, and get away from the cities where the bright lights are, and have a look at how wonderful those night skies are. They are beautiful. People have got no idea. They need to find dark country where they can get out and see it. Just get out there and pitch your tent out in the open where there's no one around you. I've been up to Mount Stromlo to the at 𝗔𝗕𝗢𝗪𝗏, and around there they were showing me with the increase in the population in rural areas like Tamworth, in our provincial townships, where the population is growing, so too is the light, and the night skies are sort of are being dulled by the lights that they have at night in those cities and country towns where they're lighting up the skies. Mining companies are starting to light up the sky out in the bush, and and they're having significant impacts on our ability to be able to read those stars. So we need to think about that for a moment, because people just can't see what's up there, and it makes it a bit hard for us who depend on that to be able to read what's going on in our society and what's going on in the world for us and around us, if the stars are dulled by the lights of the earth.
And Professor Duane, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, the best places to see it obviously are away from city lights. You want places that are high, dry, dark, still, cold. The desert I find to be one of the most remarkable places. I've been out to the Central Desert a few times, and I almost get vertigo when I look up at night. But as Uncle Ghillar said, this is one of the areas that we all need to be very cognizant about, and we can all be active participants in helping to reduce, and that's the impact of light pollution. One of the major problems of light pollution not only is growing lights, but the types of light we use. LED lights, the ones that usually get used, emit a lot of energy in the blue spectrum. That's terrible for our eyes, for our health, for the stars, and for the health and well-being of animals. So we need to move away from using those cold LED lights to using, you can still use LED lights. They need to be the warmer amber LEDs that emit more light at the red end of the spectrum. That's the same reason that astronomers always walk around with red lights. It doesn't harm our eyes. It doesn't dull the stars. It doesn't damage the wildlife. But we're literally killing ourselves with all of these lights. And LED lights are a problem because they're very cheap, so people start using more of them. And in regional towns in particular, it's becoming a problem because there is humongous scope for astrotourism and things, but it's getting wiped out by the ever-increasing LED lights.
Thank you. Well, I guess we could all sit here and talk about this all day. I know I could. I don't really want to go back to my desk. I'm going to have to read this book again because it's just so fascinating. Every time you pick it up, you read something new. So thank you so much for both of your time. I guess to wrap things up, there is an expert from the book that says there's an old saying that when an elder dies, a library dies with them. I think this is so important, particularly for us as Australians, to acknowledge the great wisdom of our First People Nation elders. Uncle Ghillar, I'd be interested to hear from you. Why is it so important for us to listen to our elders and recognise the essential contribution of Indigenous knowledge? And what would be your parting advice for us today?
Well, I think a lot of people are still learning about Australia and what the country has to offer. And the history, the past history, thousands of years of history that's occurred in this country. There's a lot more to be understood when one goes out into the deserts and have a look at the dendroglyphs and the petroglyphs that are around this country. That's our ritual statues. They tell us a lot of stories. They come from the stars. Those things are connected to the stars. That's like a library. So when you see Duane Gorge being destroyed with art and the mining companies are destroying these petroglyphs and art caves, and you know, they're taking away of our dendroglyphs from our country on the Barwon-Darling River system, and within down in central New South Wales, where they cut them down and put them in museums. They have no idea what they're looking at. They had no idea how to read them. We read them like, you know, like they do with the petroglyphs in Egypt. You know, we understand what they are. They're our stories. And we need to get them back onto the country. And so this country has so much to offer the world in terms of the experiences of a people who have, in fact, survived 2 ice ages. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And I don't think we've touched anywhere near that. And like Duane says, the opportunities of the various science and disciplines in education, we have so much to offer. Not just in story, but in science as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, thank you both of you for your time. It's been a wonderful session. I know I've learnt so much. If you are participating in this session, don't forget to go out and grab your book. It is a wonderful read. I will be reading it again. So this is what it looks like. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. And thank you, Uncle Ghillar, and thank you, Professor Duane.
Take care.
Bye.